Welcome to Breaking the Cycle of Poverty, featuring Jay Height, Executive Director of Shepherd Community Center in Indianapolis. My name is Tim Swearens, and I'm your host for these conversations that explore why poverty remains such a persistent problem in the United States. On this episode, Shepherd Assistant Director Tim Streett joins us for the second half of our discussion about key lessons he's learned after more than 25 years serving in urban ministry. Tim, thank you for joining us again for this episode. We've spent the past few months on this podcast discussing Shepherd's 10 essential assets for breaking free of poverty. You played a central role in crafting the list of assets. Why is it important for a ministry such as Shepherd to have a defined list of assets when it comes to reducing poverty? And what can you tell us about the foundational work that went into writing that list?
Well, let me answer those questions kind of in reverse, starting with the foundational work. I had been in full-time Christian urban ministry for probably about 10 years before I had my own children. We had lived in the Austin neighborhood of Chicago, and then for several years in the Martindale-Brightwood neighborhood of Indianapolis. When we started having our own kids, I had participated in starting a ministry. I had served on the staff of a large suburban church as their minister of urban outreach, and things were happening. But when I had my own kids, I began to see things a little bit differently. That'll happen, won't it? I began to see things a little bit differently, and particularly we had a lot of the kids in our neighborhood in our home all the time. One young man named Quincy was in our house all the time, but I began when I had my own kids. I kind of began to sort of compare them. Even though my kids were little, not necessarily comparing their behavior as little children, but I started noticing the kids in our neighborhood, the kids that were getting involved in this ministry called Gyro Sports that I was a part of at the time, and I started seeing them. Let's describe it as miss opportunities in their lives, pass up on things that I thought they should be involved with or should be connected with, and I started asking myself, why do these kids, why are they behaving the way they are? Why are they missing these opportunities? Why are they not taking advantage of opportunities when I am doing everything that I can do right now to teach my children to take advantage of those opportunities? And particularly as my kids got older, I saw my kids, doing things like advocating for themselves, where my neighbors' kids didn't seem to do that because I taught them to advocate for themselves. And that really began, just this thought experiment about what are the things that my kids are gaining through the way that I'm raising them, which is, even my kids are sort of what we would call third culture kids, but within our home, they were being raised with a very middle class mindset, and in comparison to how my neighbors' kids were being raised. And I just started asking myself, what do my kids possess that my neighbors lack? And I just started kind of writing them down. And then I started doing some reading, and I realized, this list that I was beginning to create, I wasn't the first to create a list like this. There's a researcher by the name of Ruby Payne, and she has, at the time, she had a list of what she called her 8 resources, and there's another organization that has the 40 developmental assets. And so I began to realize I'm not the only one thinking this way, but I just started sort of, kind of maturing the list a little bit, fleshing it out more and more. And then in the training that we were doing for the volunteers at Gyro Sports, we would talk about these things, and we would talk about these assets, and ultimately it just kind of grew from there, and ultimately when Gyro Sports merged into Shepherd, we started talking about it more, and then a few years ago, Shepherd really began to sort of adopt this model. And sort of the second question, of course, was why is it important for a ministry such as Shepherd to have a defined list of assets when it comes to reducing poverty? And I think there's a couple answers to that question. First, I mentioned the last time we were together that, the diagnosis shapes the prescription. The way we diagnose a problem determines how we respond to it. And if we see poverty as a simple problem, then we're just going to try to come up with simple solutions. If we see it as a lack of money, we're going to simply give money out. But we know that that's just not effective. And the reality is, we want to be effective. I mean, none of us want to spend 30 or 40 years of our lives doing something and then look back and go, what did we accomplish?
Right.
What was that 30 or 40 years worth? And so I think it's important for us to just really, for us as individuals and as in any ministry, I think, to just have some guiding principles that keep us on track, that we believe lead to effective ministry. Okay.
Yeah.
And in our case here with what we're doing, it's the 10 assets. In other contexts, it would be something different. And so, we want to be effective. But I think it's also important for organizations to stay on mission. Okay. What I mean by that is, this list, I think, helps us, stay on mission. If we ask ourselves, is this program that we're doing here, is it building up the assets? Is it empowering those who are participating in the program to have greater access of this asset? Or and if we're doing things that aren't doing that, we probably shouldn't be doing them. So I think it kind of helps us stay on mission. I've had the pleasure over the years of being involved in an organization called CCDA and traveling around the country and seeing lots of ministries. I've seen a lot of ministries that were sort of held up as best practices examples, and seen a lot of ministries that do a lot of things, really broad, really broad, just really try to do everything. And I always say, I think they have one thing in common, is they do them all poorly. When you try to do everything, you just don't do anything well. Okay, and I think that's really important. I've seen, and there's sort of an occupational hazard among people who do compassionate ministry, those who sort of take care of the widows and the orphans. And I think the occupational hazard is that we want to do everything. We just want to try to meet every need, and we really just can't really do that. I mean, and I've also seen a lot of ministries start programs for lots of different reasons. I've seen ministries start programs because they did a needs assessment of the neighborhood and thought, okay, this is a need, so we should try to meet this need. I've seen them start programs because there was a big grant available,
Right.
And those things rarely last. And as a matter of fact, most of those are long gone. But staying on mission and saying, is this program, is it building up the assets in our neighbors? And is the next program, is it going to build up the assets in our neighbors? Because this isn't about what we're doing. This is about whether our neighbors are becoming better equipped to break the cycle of poverty. And so I think it's important because it keeps us on task. It keeps us on mission. It helps us avoid mission creep, which is a military term, but it can happen in lots of different places.
I think one of the things that this tool has helped us is John McKnight is a professor at Northwestern and talks a lot about community asset-based development. We're talking about human asset-based development. There are a lot of great groups doing community asset-based development. That's not our focus. We see the resource to be the person. And that's the greatest asset, is a life. And we want to invest in that. And so with these 10 assets, and I appreciate, because Tim is helping us figure out how to measure that, how to say, how are we building this asset, that with that gives us the ability to measure our progress or to measure what we're not doing well, and to be very clear that at the end of the day, we want to see lives changed, not more programs grown. It's not whether Shepherd gets bigger, it's whether more lives have assets, and we're going to be able to, and through his doctoral work, be able to build the measurement tools to say, yes, this is working or it's not.
Jay, I've seen leaders in nonprofits and ministries take a competitive approach rather than a partnership approach to leadership. Tim led a separate local ministry for several years that worked to address many of the same issues that Shepherd addresses. That it's at its core. Yet you saw Tim as a partner, not a competitor. Walk us through that approach to leadership.
Well, he's still a partner, and besides that, a friend, a brother. And so I think part of understanding, we talk about poverty as not having relationships. Thankfully, Tim and I have a relationship, and we've known each other for years. I'm not always right. I know that probably shocks my wife. Tim helps me sometimes see other perspectives. His training and his academic work is crucial to each and everything that we do here. And one of my favorite leadership books is Team of Rivals,
Yes.
about Doris Goodwin's book on Lincoln's Cabinet. I think we need to have folks who have a variety of experiences. And if Shepherd hired me to be the executive director because I've had all the answers, well, a lot of those are probably wrong. And so I think collectively we are better. And Tim helps me. I'm sort of excited because we're getting more time together. During much of his PhD work, he was gone, and I missed that time because I probe his vast mind and his insights to help in what I do each and every day. I think the idea of a good leader is to see the future, and in the conversations that we have, it helps me understand better the decisions that we need to be making today so that we're ready and helping build the right assets for 5 years from now.
Yes. Tim, as we mentioned, you've been doing this work for a while. It's not an easy calling. What keeps you going? What keeps you from being discouraged?
Well, at the risk of getting a little preachy,
That's okay. You can be preachy.
I've been thinking a lot about the life of Joseph lately.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph, of course, the story of Joseph basically occupies the last 14 chapters of Genesis. Obviously, probably it is the single longest telling of a story in the Bible. So obviously a seminal character.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, one of the fathers of the tribes of Israel. Jacob's son, and everybody knows the story, or hopefully most people know the story. He's sold into slavery by his 11 brothers, or at least 10 of them, and ends up in slavery in Egypt and eventually in prison, but finds favor everywhere he goes through faithfulness and his gifts, and eventually becomes Pharaoh's number 2 man, and saves Egypt and saves his brothers as well. And there's a million sermons preached about Joseph. There's a million Sunday school lessons, and it all has to do. They almost always have to do with perseverance and faithfulness and honesty, and the lessons that we can learn for our own lives from the life of Joseph, who's this great example. And I'm not dismissing any of that. And I think that's very, very important. But I think the most important question that needs to be asked about the life of Joseph, and really all of our lives, is how did God use Joseph to advance his kingdom, his redemption story in history? Mm-hmm. And if you then read, Genesis ends with the death of Joseph. Well, then Exodus starts with, and along came a Pharaoh to whom Joseph meant nothing. Okay, and he then enslaves the Israelites because he's fearful of how they're growing and the power that they're gaining. And so the answer to the question is, how did God use Joseph? And I think this is what we miss so much about the story, is God used Joseph's life to move the Israelite nation to Egypt so that they could become enslaved, so that later he could lead them out of bondage, through the Exodus story, through Moses, okay, and advance his redemptive work throughout history, that he had promised that he would bless the world through the chosen people. The Messiah would come through, but that these chosen people would have to go through this story, okay. And so Joseph for all the great things we can learn about him, was basically just the pawn that God used to move the Israelites into slavery. And we don't want to think about it that way. Right. But I think that's the question we have to ask ourselves is God able to use me to advance his kingdom? How is he using me? And I think it's an important question because so many times we can think of our relationship with God as transactional. What is God going to do for me? What am I going to be able to do for God? Rather than how is God going to be able to use me? Okay. And I'll confess, where I am now, I would have not imagined I would be here 30 years ago. I saw myself as, as a leader in the next generation of sort of CCDA ministries, the next Wayne Gordon or Bob Lupton or something like that. And I learned early on that wasn't me. My gifts didn't lie there. Mm-hmm. I was going to be the man behind the man. I was going to be the trainer. But every once in a while now, I get the opportunity to see through somebody coming up and telling me a story of how they're in ministry today because 10 years ago they took a Poverty 101 class, yes. And they've relocated their lives and changed everything. And there's this ministry that exists because of what they're doing. And I played a small part in that. And so I get to see how God is using me in a small way, to advance his redemptive story through these others that I have the opportunity, to train a little bit. And, every time I, get discouraged, it feels like God provides me with one of those stories, and that really keeps me going.
Yeah, so that's cool. So what advice would you offer a young person or perhaps a second career person who's entering urban ministry? How can they sustain that effort?
Well, first thing I tell young people all the time, and I get this question a lot, first thing I tell people all the time is make sure you're part of a community. Don't try to do anything on your own. Mm-hmm. We made a lot of mistakes early in our ministry, 25, 30 years ago. One of that was we didn't have the right community. We thought we did, but we didn't. And that caused us a lot of years of feeling lonely and wandering in the wilderness, so to speak, spiritually at least. And so I tell people all the time, don't just say I'm gonna move into this inner city neighborhood and I'm gonna start something. Just be a part of what God's maybe already doing. Mm-hmm. Find out what God's doing and join that, or start with the work of developing a community of like-minded people. Yes. And then you can ask together, how does God want to use us? Okay. Because it's so important. Loneliness is a huge problem in our society today, but I think it's a spiritual problem as well. And I think we need to be encouraged by one another. So we really need to be in community. And then I tell kids all the time, I have an opportunity to speak to a lot of college-age kids. And I say, kind of what Jay alluded to earlier in our conversation about being a lifelong learner. Read, study, learn everything you can. And I tell young Christians all the time, you better be the most well-read person in the room. I think God calls you to be that. Yes. God calls you to learn all the time. He gave us this tremendous capacity to continue to learn. And if we don't use it, I don't think we're honoring, the way God created us. And then I would say be willing to be inconvenienced and be willing to be redirected. To say I'm going to move forward, God, because I believe you're calling me to move forward. But don't be so set on a particular path that you're unwilling to let God move you off that path a little bit. Yes. Because I look at my own life and I look at the lives of a lot of people that I know and admire in ministry, and they're not where they thought they would be, 20, 30 years ago. And it's very, very important for us to be willing and to be okay with that and to see how God's using us.
Yes. I would just echo this. If you want a job, this isn't the place. Right. If you're answering a calling, come join the team.
Yes.
But urban ministry is a calling. It's not a job. And that's where relationships like Tim and mine are beneficial.
Jay, any encouragement for ministry workers? It's just a tough time in the ministry, and any encouragement you can offer?
Well, I'm going to echo what Tim said. Jesus sent everyone out in twos. He never created ministry to be done alone, and that's the benefit that we have at a place called Shepherd Community. Far from perfect, because I'm here, but that we're able to live life together and encourage each other and to love each other. And, caring and compassion starts with each other.
Tim, thank you for joining us for these past 2 episodes. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, just really on that last question, I mean, I do get asked that a lot. How can we make a difference? It just seems so overwhelming. It seems odd, but I point to my favorite scripture, which is Genesis 22. Abraham finds out that God is sending his angels, and he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah,
yes.
or actually Sodom. And Abraham begins to argue with God. Even calls him out and says, you're about to do the wrong thing here. And he says, you destroy all these people for, you'll be destroying the innocent with the guilty. And so God and Abraham says, so if I can find, 50 righteous men, will you save the city of Sodom? And he says, yes, I'll save the city of Sodom. And in the boldest act of any human you'll probably ever see, Abraham begins to negotiate with God. Negotiates him all the way down to 10, okay? Well, God destroys Sodom. What that tells us is that Sodom was destroyed for a lack of 10 righteous people, okay? 10 righteous people could have saved the lives of all those people. If you take that scripture and then you combine it with verses like, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves, seek my face, pray, I will hear from heaven and I will heal their land. Okay. It says, if my people, those who call me Lord, will repent, seek my face, humble themselves and pray, I will heal their land. I think there's a tapestry there among all those scriptures and others that says that the health of a place, the health of a community, the health of a city, the health of a state, even the health of a nation, is not dependent upon our ability to drive away sin, because that's never going to happen. The health of a community depends on the presence of believers who are out loving their neighbors. And so, yeah, it's difficult to make a difference. But Christians living in community together, loving their neighbors, is the only thing that ever has.
Yes.
And so I think, and I have seen neighborhoods turned around by a small group of faithful believers who prayed for that neighborhood and saw God do an amazing work.
Thank you, Jay and Tim. For 37 years, Shepherd Community has made a lasting difference in the lives of thousands of neighbors, and the Shepherd team couldn't do that work without the support of donors, partners, and volunteers. To learn more about how you can help, please visit shepherdcommunity.org. Thank you for listening.
Thanks.